Well, welcome to this next narrated PowerPoint presentation. Today, we're going to talk about Congress and how a bill becomes a law. Essentially, there are 6 steps by which a bill becomes a law, and I'd like to look in more detail at those 6 steps. Along the way, we'll define some key terms, and hopefully you'll learn something new. So before we get started on some of those specific steps, I did want to start with 2 concepts. First of all, for a bill to become a law, a majority vote in support of a proposal is needed in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Secondly, the House and Senate version of a bill has to be exactly the same. So if they support a tax increase, let's just say, the House and the Senate have to support it at the same level. All the I's have to be dotted the same. All the T's have to be crossed the same. Okay? So these are 2 key concepts. Essentially, the approach here is to kind of fill out a chart, and this one deals with the first step, the introduction of a bill, and what we're going to see is what happens in the House of Representatives, what happens in the Senate, and what, if any, role the President has in each of these steps. Often, you'll see that the House and the Senate have similar things going on, but sometimes there's a slight difference. Are any of you familiar with Schoolhouse Rock? Well, one of my favorites from that program from the 1970s was I'm Just a Bill, and it offers really the best 3-minute description of how a bill becomes a law that I've ever seen. If you like, you can click on one of the hyperlinks that are on the Canvas site, and you can see this. I think it can help to provide a little bit of a humorous approach to learning about how a bill becomes a law. Alright, so I'd like to go back to that chart now, and what we're going to see is what happens in the first step when it comes to lawmaking, and that's the introduction of a bill. First of all, in the House and the Senate, a bill is given a number when it's introduced. The President can propose legislation when it comes to lawmaking, but the President has no actual power to introduce a bill on the floor of either the House or the Senate. Another thing that happens in this first step, the introduction of a bill, would be that the proposal would be read out loud, whether it deals with education, American foreign policy, tax on estates, or whatever the issue may be. It gets read out loud. It could be the entire bill, but often what happens is that an executive summary is read out loud, and then the rest of it is entered into the record. The President can propose legislation, but the President has no actual power to go on the floor of the House or the Senate to officially introduce a bill. To try to show this process in action, I often try to come up with a fictional bill and take it through these different steps. So let's just pretend that someone is going to introduce a bill on the floor of the House of Representatives. And maybe it's House Resolution number 755. And the proposal itself is very simple. The goal would be to raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour. Now, the goal of one legislator might be to increase the minimum wage, but there's one additional thing that needs to happen after a bill has been read out loud in this first step with lawmaking. The additional thing that needs to happen is that the proposal itself needs to be referred to a committee. There are numerous committees in both the House and the Senate. Much of the work in Congress takes place in these different committees. The images shown here identify some of the major committees in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House currently has 20 standing committees, and there are some others that are listed here that are additional committees, and a standing committee is one that's a permanent committee and an important one in the House as well as the Senate. The Senate has 16 standing committees. It's very difficult for all of the members of the Senate or all of the members of the House to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of a bill as it's being proposed, so much of the work of Congress takes place in these committees. Alright, so the second step in the lawmaking process would be the committee phase. Depending upon the focus of a particular bill, that proposal might get sent to an education committee. In our case, the proposal to raise the minimum wage, it might get sent to a commerce committee. So that committee would then have jurisdiction in the House and in the Senate. there are a few things that have to happen in this committee phase. In both the House and the Senate, hearings and markup take place. Once again, we're going to see how the President has very little power or authority when it comes to this committee phase. I'd like to define hearings and markup in the next couple of slides. The images here on the left show some examples of hearings. Hearings are meetings which are open to the public, where members of the House and the Senate would interview individuals. They would call upon experts in a particular field, and those experts would testify as to the strengths and the weaknesses of a bill that's been proposed. Congress wants to look at the strengths and weaknesses because an original proposal might need to be modified or even thrown out based upon the expert testimony at these hearings. Markup would take place after those hearings. The image on the right here shows an original proposal that literally was marked up with some of the changes and modifications that probably were recommended at the hearings. So if you think of it this way, think of a sheet of paper with an original proposal on it, and those bills provisions are initially written in there. Well, they're often rewritten and modified based upon the expert testimony of people at those hearings. In fact, most of the bill's specific provisions are actually written in this committee phase during markup, as opposed to when the bill was originally introduced in the House or the Senate. Okay, so now we're back to our original proposal to raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour. Based upon that expert testimony, more than likely that original proposal is going to be modified or marked up. Let's just say business owners come in and they say, we cannot afford to give our employees $10 an hour. So maybe that original proposal to increase the minimum wage to $10 an hour would be lowered to $9 an hour. Also, based upon that expert testimony, maybe some labor advocates would come in and say, how about overtime? Maybe people working over 40 hours a week should be paid at a different rate. So here you see some potential examples of how a bill might get marked up during this second phase in the committees. Hearings are held and markup takes place during this second step, or the committee phase. But there's something else that takes place as well. Another thing that happens in this committee phase is that the members of the committee make a recommendation and they vote. They might vote to approve or to kill a proposal. If they support it, then they'll vote to approve it. If they don't support it, they might kill it. Here is a statistic. About 95% of all bills that have been introduced, they've been read out loud, they've been referred to a committee, about 95% of those bills die in committee. Often what might happen is that you may have 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of a proposal, whether it's a tax cut, whether it's a new regulation when it comes to environmental laws, or whether it's a new proposal to help provide aid to business owners and things like that. But about 95% of all bills die in committee. If a proposal is approved by at least a majority of the members of a committee in the United States Senate, then we would move on to step number 3. However, there's one last thing that has to happen if you're in the House of Representatives. In the House, there's a Rules Committee, and so the Rules Committee would establish rules for debate. Generally speaking, what this House committee would do is they would establish a time limit on the amount of time that the bill can be debated and whether or not it can be changed or amended by other members of the House during when they take up a proposal. As long as a majority of the members of the committee in either the House or the Senate support a proposal, then we would move on to step number 3. This allows the full House, or all the members of the House and all the members of the Senate, to address a bill that's under consideration. So, what happens here? Well, in the House and the Senate, it would be debate. Once again, the President has no specific power or authority when it comes to this step number 3. Debate in the House of Representatives tends to be very strict and limited. However, something can happen in the United States Senate when it comes to debate, and I'd like to talk about that next. If a senator is strongly opposed to a proposal, a senator can stage a filibuster. This is when one senator, or possibly a group of senators, engage in continuous speech. It can bring all Senate activity to a complete halt. This can happen only if a senator keeps talking and they remain standing. In the past, they've read things like the United States Constitution. They've read the Bill of Rights. They've even read the Washington, D.C. phone book. However, today, they generally simply talk and talk and talk and talk about an issue in hopes that their obstructionist tactics could bring all discussion to an end because they're strongly opposed to a particular proposal. There is a way to end a filibuster, however. That's called a cloture vote. If 60 senators support an end to a filibuster, the individuals engaged in the filibuster can only continue their continuous speech for an additional 20 hours. Then they have to stop. And that's called, again, a cloture vote. Any piece of legislation has the potential to take away our rights. So that's why the ability to stage a filibuster is an important part of the Senate workings. We've had a variety of filibusters in the past. Possibly one of the most famous filibusters never was real. It was in a movie from 1939, and it was called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The longest filibuster in American history was undertaken by Strom Thurmond in the 1950s. He was opposed to some civil rights legislation, and he took the floor of the Senate, and he held it for 24 hours and 18 minutes. In recent years, we've seen a couple of filibusters. On the right, we see an image of Rand Paul, a senator from Kentucky. He was opposed to the use of the drone strikes by the Obama administration, and he wanted a clarification as to whether or not an American citizen could be a victim of a drone strike. Another example in the fall of 2013 is that Senator Ted Cruz was opposed to the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and he staged a filibuster of about 21 hours. In addition to debate, something else happens with step number 3 when the full House and Senate get to address a proposal, and that would be earmarking. Earmarking is when a member of the House or the Senate include a specific project in a bill that's under consideration. Usually they want to do this because maybe it will provide a special tax break to a company in their district, or maybe it's funding for a project in their state that would help to bring money and or jobs to their state. A slang term associated with earmarking would be pork barrel projects, because some of these projects are really good projects and they do a good job of beautifying a state, or maybe they help with the state park system or something along those lines, but they can also be wasteful. And so that's why currently there are restrictions placed on these so-called earmarks, and a lot of people are upset about them. But sometimes they can be good, sometimes they can be wasteful. But the pig here shows this pork barrel interpretation of wasteful spending associated with Congress. Not all of these earmarks are wasteful. I remember a few years ago there was a press conference at West Shore Community College because one of the specific earmarks included in a piece of legislation was a specific amount of $400,000 that West Shore Community College received in order to retrain displaced workers. There was a high unemployment rates, and Congressman Hoekstra, who was the congressman at the time, was able to get $400,000 earmarked for West Shore Community College. Other examples of earmarks would be Manastee's Hospital and Manastee's Blacker Airport. I know have received earmarks in the past. Ludington's Harbor, Pentwater's Harbor, Manastee's Harbor, all the way up to Frankfurt. In the past there have been specific earmarks in order to dredge those harbors because they fill up with silt, and it can be difficult for large barges to come in with their goods and to leave. And actually, this can be a barrier for local businesses. And so that's why those earmarks are included and have helped a lot of local businesses in the past. Okay, after all of the debating, after any new provisions may or may not have been added to a proposal, the last thing that happens with step number 3 would be a vote. A majority vote in support of that proposal would be needed to go to step number 4. That's required in both the House and the Senate. Let's go back to that proposal of House Resolution number 755 to raise the minimum wage. Let's pretend this has gone through step number 1, 2, and 3, and the bill has passed in the House of Representatives. That's great for advocates who want an increase in the minimum wage. But wait a minute. For a bill to become a law, it has to pass in the House and the Senate. So this proposal would then get sent over to the Senate, and the whole process would start all over again with step number 1 there. All right, so House Resolution number 755 is passed in the House. This gets sent to the Senate, and the Senate would introduce the bill and give it a number. Let's just say it's Senate Bill number 130. They decide that they want to raise the minimum wage to $11 an hour. Furthermore, they support overtime itself and increased pay for overtime. But their rate of overtime is $15 an hour. So something's passed in the House and the Senate, but it's not the exact same proposal. That would take us to step number 4. Step number 4 is called the conference phase. This would be necessary if similar bills pass in both the House and the Senate, but they're not exactly the same. What happens here is that a committee made up of a handful of the members of the House, maybe 3 or 4, and a handful of members of the Senate, again, maybe 3 or 4. What they do is they sit down and they try to work out a compromise on the different versions of the bills. Once again, the president can talk about the importance of a proposal. He could try to lobby members of Congress in support or opposition to something that's under discussion. But the president has no specific power or authority in step number 4. So again, in this conference phase, a handful of the members of the Senate and the House get together and they work out a compromise. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that they agree to split the difference between the two proposals and both support an increase in minimum wage to $10 an hour. When it comes to overtime, again, let's just assume that the two split the difference and they support an increase in overtime pay to $17.50 an hour. That conference phase is important because that small committee has worked out any of the differences between the two proposals and they've compromised. However, only a handful of the members of the House and the Senate have approved that. Well, as long as they work out the differences in the compromise, that would take us to step number 5. Step number 5 allows all of the members of the House of Representatives and all of the members of the Senate the opportunity to vote in favor of or to reject the compromise version that had been developed by the conference committee. Once again, the president has no specific power or authority in step number 5. As long as there's a majority vote in support of the proposal at this point, finally we get to go to step number 6, which is the last step. Step number 6 finally allows the president some actual authority. The House and the Senate have proposed a bill, they've agreed to it, and they send it off to the president. If a bill is made it this far and it gets sent to the president has 3 options. First, the president can sign a bill, he can veto it if he's opposed to it, or the president can do nothing. So let's look at these actions in a little more detail. If the president supports a proposal, he can sign it, and boom, that bill becomes a law. On the left, we see some images associated with signing ceremonies involving both Presidents Obama and George W. Bush. If the president is opposed to a proposal, that bill gets returned to Congress, and I'll come back to that in a second. If the president does nothing, well, I'm not going to tell you what happens if the president does nothing. I'm going to make you wait. When we talk about the presidency in more detail, I'll discuss what can happen if the president does nothing with a bill. We'll come back to that, I promise. Even if the president is opposed to a bill, Congress can still take up that proposal. They vote on it again. And if a 2/3 majority of the members of the House of Representatives support that proposal, and a 2/3 majority in the Senate also concur and support it, that presidential veto is overridden or overruled. So here we are back to that chart. If the president issues a veto override vote is taken in both the House and the Senate, and if they vote to override the presidential veto by that 2/3 majority, a bill can become a law even without the president's authority or approval. Well, today I tried to talk about the process by which a bill becomes a law. I've identified 6 steps in that process. Hopefully, you've learned something new today. Take care, and if you have any questions, feel free to bring them to class next time we meet. Have a good day.